Hello, welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you everyone for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing Google's quality guidelines, and specifically we're going to be addressing the EAT initiative. Really our goal for today is to set everyone up so they can eat and not be eaten. My name is Corbin Faber. I am the manager of our managed services division here at Conductor, which is really just our SEO consultative arm of our services division. And we are super lucky today to be joined by the very impressive Lily Ray, who is the director of SEO at Path Interactive.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. All right, so guys, let's jump into it. The agenda that we're going to cover today is reviewing what is Google's EAT initiative. Let's give some history and some background. And then we're going to go into what we've actually noticed today. What are the trends that have occurred since the latest updates, and where do we actually see this going in the future? And specifically, we want to make sure that we're providing specific recommendations on how we can actually be implementing some of these strategies moving forward. And we'll also be opening this up to questions towards the end, so anyone that has questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type those in and we will get to them towards the end of the webinar. Let's get started. Let's start off with what is Google's EAT initiative. Lily, kick us off.
Sure, yeah. So Google's EAT initiative, first of all, EAT is an acronym that stands for Expertise, Authoritativeness, and Trust. So this is not a new initiative. This is actually something that Google rolled out in about 2014 in their Search Quality Rater Guidelines. And these guidelines are a document that Google uses to basically contract 10,000 individuals around the world and give them these guidelines and tell them, you know, we're going to give you a handful of different web pages and we want you to assess the quality of these web pages using the criteria that we've laid out in the guidelines. So EAT is something that they introduced in the 2014 version of that document, and they really started to get into the nitty-gritty of what it means to have expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness, both in the sense of who's writing the content and who owns the website, and really just looking at, you know, the authority metrics and signals behind content creators in general.
Yeah, absolutely. If we want to maybe break down each of the individual letters here, like going into expertise, I really see that as the actual creator of the content. Right. Do they have that expertise? Do they have that actual credibility to give Google really really what they're looking for is just the certainty that they can trust the person who is creating that content to push them up in the actual proper rankings and serve that to their users.
Right.
And then when we think of authority, to me, that is really more so around the actual site and the actual credibility of the brand and the person who's actually producing and publishing that content. So a little bit more around, do they have content that also speaks to this topic? Do they have the credibility in that space in general?
For sure. Definitely. And trustworthiness, too, is something that can be part of, you know, when we're assessing the main creator and the writer of the content, we look for trustworthiness in terms of what they've written before, but it's also a domain-wide metric. So we look for things like HTTPS, you know, customer service, all those signals that kind of factor into overall domain authority, and trustworthiness is something that factors into EAT as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, too, for the other factors outside of the actual content. It's also, does this web page appear to be trustworthy? Does it have the signals of a quality site? Does it tell us about the company? Do we know who they are, what they're actually trying to achieve with their site overall as well? So
exactly.
That's really the basis of the EAT initiative overall.
Definitely. So Corbin, what changes have occurred recently as they relate to EAT?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an interesting one because I'm not so sure a ton has really changed in the initiative overall. To me, it's really Google taking it more seriously. They're really trying to, as they always are, make this a high priority, that they're serving content that's going to be highly relevant and highly sought after content and ones that are really certifiable in the sense that it's something that's they trust and are something that's going to actually drive the type of experience users are looking for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would say August 1st, 2018 was a very big day in the SEO community, as many of us know all too well. Mm-hmm. Definitely one of the biggest algorithm updates we've seen in many years. And since then, there have been a number of kind of aftershocks and corrections to the algorithm as well. So certainly a lot of changes, almost to the point where it's kind of hard to keep track of even what's happening with the algorithm. Yeah. But it appears that it's tied to EAT and definitely trust signals, both in terms of author credentials, credibility of the main writer of the content, and also just the domain authority metrics as well. So this is still somewhat speculative. It's something that Google has pointed us to as an indication of what might be happening, but Google has also come out and said, you know, this isn't purely how the algorithm is performing, it's just where we want the algorithm to go. So it's really important to keep that in mind. You know, implementing EAT changes to your website isn't something that's necessarily going to create instant boosts in your rankings, but it's something that we know that Google's really putting a lot more priority on.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really a strong point there where it is speculative to the extent that we're taking these guidelines that they're saying, hey, human beings, you should be judging content based off of this criteria, and we can then leverage that to say, okay, if that's what they're saying their raters should be judging the criteria on, then let's make sure our content actually fits in within that criteria.
Right.
And I think the big piece for the August update, too, is that Google's taking this more and more seriously, that they need to make sure the content they're serving is actually going to be right and correct. You know, there's been a ton of backlash towards fake news and all of that information, and so that is a major issue for them if there's continued to be that type of backlash. So they need to take the proper steps to ensure that the content they're serving has that expertise and authority and trust behind it.
Yeah, I agree. And definitely what's interesting about the most recent version of the search quality guidelines is the fact that Google went into a lot of specifics about what it means to be low quality. They gave a lot of very specific examples. So things like not backing up medical claims, using exaggerated or shocking titles, making it hard to locate who the author is of the content and what that author has written before, and even going so far as to say, you know, if this is someone writing about pumpkin pie recipes, do we know that they've written about baking in the past? So they're getting really granular with what they're looking for, and it's not enough to just say, you know, hey, I'm a writer that enjoys writing about medical topics. Now you actually have to prove and display on your website that you have the credentials to be able to write about these things.
Yep, absolutely. Why should they believe you?
Exactly.
Well, great. So everyone on the webinar, we want to kick it out to have an actual poll question. So we'd love to get your feedback on how you have actually noticed EAT make an impact on your strategies thus far. Give everyone a few minutes to contribute, and then we'll check out the results. All right, let's see the feedback we've gotten so far. All right, so actually 12%, over 12% saying yes a lot. I find that actually a little bit surprising. When we were first talking about this, we thought that it might be a lot of people who aren't totally sure about it. But that's great to see that, you know, people are taking this into account and applying it to their strategy.
And seeing results as well. Yeah, right. That's great.
35%, just about, have said it's somewhat impacting strategy, so really starting to take into account the AET initiative and work it in. 11% not at all, and then 42% just about is unsure. And I think that was kind of what we were thinking of as being one of the areas that we had the expectations of it being highest, just because this is newer, it is a bit speculative, and you know, trying to work it into your strategy could take some time.
Yeah, and you know, this is a different type of algorithm update. You know, in the past we've had updates like Penguin, where we know, okay, I've been building bad backlinks. I'm going to go do a reconsideration request, and I'm going to disavow them, and I'll probably see instant results. this is not how this algorithm appears to be performing. We're definitely seeing a situation where not only are there constant aftershocks and different changes to the algorithm happening almost every week or a few times per week, but we're also these are a little bit more theoretical types of changes that we're making in nature, so it's hard to say who's credible enough, who has the right amount of authority that Google's looking for. So I think it's something where we are going to continue to be a little bit uncertain about how this is performing, but I do think it's the right direction that we need to go as SEOs, just because we know this is something that Google cares a lot about.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into some of the more specific strategic recommendations we may have, but I agree with you, and it's also something that you can't change overnight necessarily, right? You need to actually get the right expertise and the right authority and build upon that over time.
For sure.
All right. Well, the next question we wanted to tackle was, how were different industries impacted?
Yeah, so, when August 1st happened and we saw a lot of fluctuations in the rankings of a lot of different websites, including very major websites that previously had a huge amount of market share, especially in the health and wellness category, we instantly kind of named this the Medic update because it appeared to be so closely tied to medical content. But then we kind of quickly realized within the coming days that this was actually an across-the-board update. It didn't just affect medical websites. I think in the first week we noticed about 41% of the sites that were affected fell into the health and wellness category. But we definitely saw huge impacts to e-commerce websites, insurance and financial, travel and business, and then some other types of sites as well. But I think the big kind of underlying factor with the types of sites that were hit were that they were what Google considers to be YMYL, or Your Money, Your Life websites, which it defines as financial websites, sites where you can do shopping or e-commerce, medical websites, legal sites, news and politics information, and then even things like, child adoption or car safety. So really any of these sites that can have an actual impact on your well-being and your happiness, your financial stability, these are the types of sites that we think were most predominantly hit by this update.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny how quick we are to name these updates sometimes, and with the Medic update, it's definitely the case. But I know, like you had pointed out, there's other third-party reviews from SEMrush to Moz who had looked at this across a variety of industries and seen really a shift in rankings that expanded beyond just our initial thoughts of the healthcare and financial industries.
For sure.
And I think to the Your Money, Your Life aspect of the content, that's I think goes beyond what people might initially think of as that, where maybe it's just, hey, if it directly impacts my health or my money, then those are the only two categories that it really falls into. But you really have to think beyond that to, just shopping decisions, news articles, different information that might go beyond just looking at those two sectors. So it can really have a wide impact, and I see it even expanding beyond where it's hit so far.
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's really interesting. There's been a lot of side conversations related to this update about the BBB. They actually do get into talking about the BBB and the search quality guidelines, but there was kind of this following discussion on Twitter about whether or not Google's actually capable of going and looking at BBB ratings as an SEO ranking factor, and they said, no, we're not quite there yet. But the fact that they talk about this in the search quality guidelines kind of gives you an idea of the fact that they're looking for these kind of third-party citations and trust signals around companies. So I think Dr. Axe is one example where there's a couple things going on there that we'll talk about, but he had poor ratings on the Better Business Bureau, and that's something that we think might have actually factored into the fact that his site took a really, really big hit on August 1st. So things like, not addressing complaints as far as your return policies go or your customer service, this is something that Google's kind of turning the dial up on, especially with e-commerce sites, because if you think about it, Google doesn't want to rank and display websites that go and lead users to having a poor experience or being scammed or having their money taken from them or whatever the case may be. It reflects poorly on them as a search engine. So that's where I think a lot of the impetus for this algorithm update is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the takeaway for me on this is if you're in the healthcare and financial sector, this is an absolute must to concentrate on. But even if you're outside of that, think about if you're influencing any decision really that users are making, you can be grouped into that your money, your life type of environment, because anything that's impacting really the happiness, as they say in the guidelines of users, can be grouped as that really that type of content that they're going to be super scrutinous on in terms of how high credibility it is.
For sure. So what have we noticed so far?
So this is a good question. This is really more how have we actually seen this impact live sites and really seen it in the wild so far. And we both, I think, have the opportunity to work across a number of different websites. And what I've seen so far is really this has had an impact across a wide variety of different industries, as we talked about in which ones were impacted. E-commerce is one area that I've seen a pretty large impact on. If you're directly selling items from your site, you're going to be under scrutiny from Google to make sure that you're providing the right information. And also have two specific examples that we could run through really quickly, both from a positive impact and a negative impact to take some learnings from. So the first, from a positive perspective, is there is actually a healthcare site that we had been tracking, and it's really a network of doctors and surgeons. And they had actually seen an increase in 27% of their page one position keywords since August, actually. And really what we've deemed as the major benefit that they've been able to draw from this is that they have this network of surgeons and of doctors that they've successfully leveraged to really promote as the authority behind the content that they're creating. They promote those surgeons very well, and they actually even open them up to answer questions for their users. So whether it be specifically for that individual page that one of those experts is writing for, or even just the fact that based off of their holistic content strategy, they've been able to really drive that overall authority to their site. The one area where we have seen some negative impact is more of a nutrition and supplements website, which had been performing extremely well with their blog content, really had a stranglehold on a lot of their non-branded terms. But similar to your Dr. Axe example, they actually had a lot of negative reviews out there. So their actual branded terms were never really performing well, but they were able to make up for that with the non-brand content that they had. And after this update, they lost that non-brand equity that they previously had, just because Google was able to tie back these negative results to them and say, hey, if people don't trust your brand, we're not going to trust the content that you're creating either. So I think reputation management is a huge piece of this as well.
Totally. Yeah, and in terms of what we've noticed on the agency side, a lot of what you said is kind of what we've seen in our own client, impact after August 1st. But we have had a couple clients that were in the healthcare industry that were hit really hard by August 1st and kind of the aftershocks that came afterwards. And what we noticed right off the bat is that, even though these clients of ours did have EAT built into their business model, they weren't necessarily disclosing those things on the website. So they might have had really great medical content that was actually written by a doctor who, went to Harvard or had the actual credentials to be able to talk about these topics, but we didn't disclose that on the website. So we didn't actually go into the blog and list their name. And then, alongside their name, we didn't give the user the ability to click on their name and learn a little bit more about that doctor and maybe link back to that doctor's credentials or their bio on the Harvard website or their LinkedIn profile or whatever the case may be. So we noticed that the sites that outranked our client sites were doing a lot of that. They had really kind of over-the-top editorial policies. They had not only their writers listed with their writer bios, but also who medically reviewed that content and their credentials. They had all their citations listed at the end of the article. So a lot of the kind of things that Google talked about in the search quality guidelines did seem to kind of manifest themselves in terms of who did come out on top after these algorithm updates. So it was very interesting. And going back to the Dr. Axe example, what was really interesting about that not only the fact that the BBB seemed to play into it, but also the fact that this was someone who had a huge market share in the health industry on Google for a very long time. The website has all the traditional SEO ranking factors built in quite well. So it's fast, it's mobile responsive, HTTPS, good quality content, or so we thought. And this is a site that took a nosedive after August 1st. So what's interesting about that is that if you read Dr. Axe's bio, if you're a doctor, you might take up issue with the actual credentials that he has to write about these topics. You know, he's more of a holistic practitioner than an actual MD. So, you know, is Google now coming in and establishing what type of credentials are necessary to write about this content? Because it seems like that might be what's happening. And then just another thing that was definitely echoed many times throughout the quality guidelines is actually the discussion of ads and how ads are displayed on the page. So one thing that we noticed was that a lot of sites that took a hit were kind of masking their ads or making their ads appear as part of the main content. So, you know, a situation where you scroll down on the page and you see a bunch of things that actually look like articles but are actually links to affiliate sites, you know, making that kind of shady and hard for the user to distinguish between the main content and the ads. That's something that we think has caused a lot of websites to take a big hit. And then, you know, just if you have banner ads that are taking up the majority of the page, or if you have ads that autoplay and make it really hard for the user to turn it off, those types of things Google's actually taking into consideration now as an SEO ranking factor.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to the trust
Right.
aspect of this, right? Where we all know we've had this experience where within a half a second of entering a site, you kind of get a sense of, is this a site that I trust? Is this one that I think I can take the content seriously or not? And so making sure that you are presenting your content, your brand, your site in the best way possible is super important.
Definitely.
And then to the expertise portion of that too, when you were speaking about Dr. Axe, I think one item that's worth highlighting is how Google's asking their rankers to actually think about expertise, where they're breaking it up in kind of two areas where it's requiring either formal expertise or everyday expertise.
Right.
Where the formal is those areas where you really need to have a certification or a license or something that can really back your actual expertise in that area, because it's obviously something where you need to really be a formal expert in. But then there's also the everyday expertise, which is just ordinary people sharing life experiences, where maybe you don't need a license to tell me what the best jeans are in the marketplace, but if you do, but you still need to have that background and that credibility of, hey, I've talked about fashion in the past, or I've talked about this topic in the past. So
For sure.
making sure that you understand where you might fall in those types of content, and then back up your expertise with whichever way is best based off of the content you're creating.
Yeah, that's a really good point. One thing that Google mentions in the search quality guidelines is, you know, you can be an expert on something that, you know, it's not YMYL in nature. They use one example where it's a restaurant, and they use the About page for the restaurant as an example of a very high quality page. And this is literally a website that probably hasn't been updated in a very long time. It's just the bio, hey, we're a family restaurant, we serve this type of food, this is our address and our phone number, and come visit us if you want to have a great steak, or, you know, something like that. But Google actually calls that a high quality page because they're telling the truth, that's what they are, you know, and they're an expert on their restaurant. So it's not the case that you have to be like the most highly educated, well-credentialed person to be an expert. You can actually just be an expert on your own topic.
Absolutely. So, big question. This is what people came for. What can you do to be more eat-friendly?
Yeah, so I mean, at least what we are trying to do at my agency, Path Interactive, is really kind of digest the search quality guidelines and all the different recommendations that Google's laid out for us, and to the best of our ability, try to get those rolled out across our client sites. So for one thing, you know, for clients that are not currently naming their authors on their content, we are going and trying to adjust that. So we're disclosing who the authors are, we're giving a little bit of information about those authors, creating author bio pages, linking to their social media and to any other kind of examples of their writing on the web. For e-commerce clients, as we mentioned, including detailed customer service information and return policy information, you know, not sending our customers in circles trying to return a product or get in touch with someone. Obviously, things like HTTPS was a huge ranking factor and signal that Google put out for the past couple of years, so just making sure that's rolled out across all sites. Third-party reviews on, Yelp and Trustpilot and these other kind of third-party sites that can act as a citation for your own content, just making sure those reviews are up to par. Making sure that our clients have operational Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter accounts when applicable. Creating editorial policies and About Us pages if the clients don't already have those, making them a little bit more robust. And, for clients that are making medical claims or any other YMYL type claims, just making sure that those have citations and they're linking to the place where they got that information. And last point is kind of an interesting one, and this is a big shift that we've kind of had to internalize at our agency, is that, Google's asking us to kind of stick to one topic or stick to just what we're good at. So if you are an insurance company, maybe you don't want to write about top 10 things to do in the summertime in Miami, because that's not actually what your company specializes in.
Yep.
So really just trying to focus our content on what our brands do is something that we're trying to roll out for our clients as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and also gets to the issue of resourcing, right? We totally understand that we don't have an infinite amount of writers, we don't have an infinite amount of dev support to be creating this content. So making sure that we're actually touching upon the areas that our business and our brand is most focused on, and also that our users care most about, is going to help us in this initiative, but also in just our content strategy in general as well. So I really like that. And another piece, and some things that I'm starting to think about too, is starting to potentially categorize the content that we're creating as well against these guidelines to see which is the content that might fall under that YMYL umbrella, which is ones that might need really that high level of expertise, and which is ones that may require more of the everyday expertise. And then when we're actually building out content calendars or content plans, factoring that into how we're actually developing the content right from the start, so we know who we should be getting to write this content, how their credibility will actually align with the topic that we're discussing, and what that means in terms of timelines and everything related to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think another thing we've been a little bit more careful about is if and when we do, hire freelance writer talent, we look more closely at the credentials if they're going to be writing about these YMYL topics, because it's obviously really important to be able to disclose what those credentials are, why this person should be able to write about these things, and, looking for writers who actually do want to build a name for themselves, because you should be willing to put your name behind this content. That's kind of the way Google's looking at it. We should know who you are, and, Google kind of, its algorithm is capable of understanding personas and authors, and that's something that they're also turning up the dial on. So, if you are someone who has a vested interest in producing content that you want on Google, from their perspective, they want to know who you are and what you've written before and why we should trust you.
Yep, absolutely. And one thing they kind of hone in on in the guidelines is looking at the main content, what they refer to as the MC, throughout the guidelines.
Yeah.
And that's really the crux of the copy and the main portion of the actual content of the page. And so I think when you're trying to evaluate your success or your current standing within EAT, that's a great place to start. They also point out that they're evaluating content that's maybe there's nothing wrong with, but there's nothing special about it. And I feel like that's probably where most content falls right now. And so being able to evaluate and uncover those types of content that you have across the site, most likely they're the ones that are ranking okay but not great, or driving a decent amount of traffic but aren't really your golden tickets or your main traffic drivers. Identify those, find out what the actual topic is, uncover all of the questions people are asking around that topic, and really invest time to make that as good and as high quality as you possibly can, because that's where you'll actually be able to see the results and actually see some gains.
Yeah, definitely.
The only final piece of this that I would highlight is just think about localization too, because that's another piece that they're outlining in the guidelines, where quality might mean different things to different people, and either globally or even nationally. So taking into consideration what people care about in those areas that your business is focused in, and then framing the content based off of that is another piece that I think can't be overlooked.
It's a really good point, definitely. So what have we implemented in our customer strategies as it relates to EAT?
Yeah, so I think the first step of this is really starting to almost change the conversation around content creation and content optimization. It's not that just making minor title tag changes and H1 changes isn't going to help, but we need to change kind of the framework of that being the main objective of our content strategy and start to think about it as actually developing a full plan and a full robust strategy of content that's going to address the right questions and putting the user and the customer first, because that's really, at the end of the day, what Google is trying to achieve here, is just providing the best, most accurate content for their users. And so if we change our mindset, start thinking of it in that way, then I think that's where the most success can come from when we're actually developing a content strategy.
Yeah, definitely. I think, one thing that we always do in the SEO world and that we always think about is quality of content. This isn't a new topic. It's something that Google has been talking about for many years. But I think it's more important than ever to really take a holistic look at your content, what you've produced in the past, whether it's on brand, whether it's something that you're actually an expert in, or whether it's just fluff that you're producing because you want to keep a certain cadence of producing content. So I think it's more important than ever to not say, hey, we need to write 10 articles per month. Now it's about, like, maybe we only write 2 or 3, but we know those are well researched and we know that we've done our homework and we have experts chiming in and we're citing our sources. So just thinking long and hard about what we produce and then also going back and maybe cleaning up articles that aren't performing well, articles that aren't on brand. We do a lot of merging and consolidating of content. Removing bad content is not a scary thing in the SEO world. Some people are afraid to kind of delete and redirect articles, but we've seen a lot of strong performance take place after we've done those types of initiatives. We actually are now in a situation where for a handful of our clients, we are going back and retroactively adding citations to many claims that we've made. So we actually have citation projects that are just ongoing projects where we go back for dozens and dozens of articles and say, you know what, I think I kind of took that from another website. Even if I paraphrased, it's probably best to say where I got it from, because the reality is Google can figure that out anyway. Right. So it's better to just give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, in the past you might think it's better if I just write out and don't quote someone else, don't link to someone else, but now you really want to cite those experts because that's just going to further bolster the fact that you are getting this information from someone who's qualified.
Exactly. It makes you sound more trustworthy, and then it also kind of inspires you to say, you know what, I want people to link to me, so maybe I need to do my own proprietary research and come up with my own statistics so that I'm organically getting those types of links as well. So it's kind of like being back in high school and knowing how to cite your sources when you're writing a term paper,
Bibliography.
Yeah, exactly. And then, as it relates to ads, I think this is something that's really important, and it's kind of uncomfortable to talk about because a lot of websites obviously make money through ads, but Google is now really wrapping up the experience of ads, how you display your ads, as this is now part of the SEO landscape, and this is now something that we have to take into consideration. So if you're making it confusing for your users, first of all, how you make money, tricking them into clicking on things by making it look like the main content of the page, using related content at the bottom that it looks like you're clicking on a related post, but really it's taking you to an external site. All of those things are not really things you can get away with anymore. So just making sure that none of our clients are doing that. And then,
and I think, just to build on that, I think Google obviously knows there's publishers and people who their main source of revenue is ads.
Of course.
So if you have ads, that's not necessarily going to be a major issue, but just make sure, like you're saying, it's not overly invasive and it's not misleading, because that's really where you're going to get in trouble.
For sure.
And I think more and more so, it's also even if you're promoting yourself with ads, if through interstitials or offering promotions, that can be another thing that looks at negatively if you're impacting or negatively impacting the user experience overall with, overly, saturating the page with that type of content.
Definitely, and that's something that we also did see as part of the update is publishers, especially medical publishers, who were too salesy in their content or they had too many links to their products within medical content. That's something that Google raised a flag on. So it's really important, even if you are selling a product, which is fine, not to kind of make your salesy content and your informational content too blended together, because Google doesn't want to see those two things together. They want informational content for informational sake, and then your sales content on a different page, or maybe, you know, a discrete link to that page. So sites that had intrusive interstitials or just too many calls to action were some of the sites that were hit by this update. And lastly, you know, addressing bad reviews is never fun, but especially on things like Google My Business, it's relatively easy to address those. You know, Yelp is a little bit harder. It's kind of different depending on the platform, but it's certainly important to make that part of your digital marketing strategy, at least to come up with a solution for how are we going to handle bad reviews. You know, if you're on Amazon, there's tools like ReviewBox where you can actually manage those at scale. I think this is something that we have to think about that as part of our organic strategy.
Absolutely. Reputation management is a huge portion of this, and we run into it sometimes where it's almost like if we don't talk about it, then it doesn't exist.
Right.
But these conversations are happening on the web whether we want them to or not, so let's try to participate and own those conversations as much as we can.
Definitely.
And yeah, I think the other aspect of this in terms of implementing it with customer strategies is really trying our best to leverage the in-house experts that they may already have.
Right.
And this can take a lot of education, some organic search evangelism to get some buy-in from those experts who are of course extremely busy and may not see the larger benefit of contributing to a blog post or helping craft content for the website. But we all know that there are those in-house experts. Every brand that we work across has them, or else they wouldn't be experts in their field. And so we need to find our best ways of actually being able to leverage those folks, because that's really the low-hanging fruit of who we can really tap into to further bolster the credibility of our content.
Yeah, and just related to that, a lot of times when I talk to my clients about EAT, especially for newer sites or startups, it's like, how can I possibly compete in this new world? So one thing we've been suggesting is maybe you work with someone who is an established expert, and maybe they can do a guest blog post on your blog, because Google looks to that as like, hey, this person's willing to write on this website. They're probably, they probably trust that website, and they probably feel good about what they're doing. So not being afraid to reach out to, guest bloggers or guest contributors who already do have established expertise, I think is a good way for newer sites to get their foot in the door. Yeah, and there's definitely strategic ways of going about that, right, and uncovering who the thought leaders are in that space. For sure. We oftentimes will develop just, keyword lists around particular topics that we're most interested in, find who is ranking best within that topic, and then review who the actual authors are when they're actually listed, or who's showing up maybe in social media around those topics. So then that way you can start to develop a list of who are the actual thought leaders, who is most trusted within your space, within your individual topic that you're speaking to, and then perform outreach from there to try to get some citations or even actual guest posts like you were mentioning. Definitely. All right, so how should we plan for the future of EAT? All right, so this is interesting. How is it going to evolve from here? And I think this is, it's definitely still new, still trying to be taken into account. But the area that I see this really developing most is, I would say, I guess, twofold. The first is I think it's going to continue to be impactful beyond just that main YMYL content. So if you're seeing your site not really be impacted, your industry not really be impacted, I wouldn't take that for granted. I would plan ahead and say, okay, we haven't been hit as much as others, but let's assume we're going to in the near future. And then the other piece of this that I think is going to play a major factor is beyond just written content. How are you providing a strong experience and a valuable information for your users? So right now we kind of think of that as just the actual copy, but what are the other ways that you can provide a better experience for users? And as Google and other search engines are getting better and better at being able to interpret that type of information, they're going to take that into account as well. So whether it be a quiz that provides you the right information based off of some inputs, or if it's a calculator, as long as you're providing an experience that's going to create the
the best information for that user, you're going to be rewarded for it. So, I think starting to think outside the box, outside of just providing straightforward content, will be where I'm going to try to guide my strategies moving forward too.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think the whole future of EAT is a really interesting conversation. It's not a coincidence that these updates happened at the same time as Google's been rolling out a lot of different types of updates with how the SERP actually looks. So, and also the fact that voice search is on the rise. So, when it comes to Google's structured data updates and featured snippets changing, we're seeing Google taking a lot more content from publishers and almost repurposing that content on the SERP as if Google wrote it itself in some cases.
Right.
So from that perspective, if Google's going to be presenting information as if it's its own, it's in Google's best interest to make sure that this content is credible, and that ties into voice search because, the Google Home in many cases reads the featured snippet out loud. So let's say you ask the Google Home a medical question and it reads you the wrong answer. That makes Google look really bad. Yeah. And we all know what happens when large tech agencies get into these types of scandals. It's definitely something that Google wants to avoid if it can. So I think, even if there's a lot of debate right now in the SEO community about whether or not this is even happening, whether the data supports it, but we know that Google cares a lot about displaying extremely trustworthy content, and we know that it's in its best interest. So when we're creating websites and creating pages, we have to stop and think before we launch the page, what is the main purpose of this page? Am I writing enough words to achieve that purpose? Do I have the right people writing it? Is it a good experience for the user? Am I trying to trick the user into doing something or taking an action that he or she might not want to take? Because all these questions need to be answered first before we launch the page, because we know that this is where the algorithm's going. And yeah, just thinking about credibility of who's writing your content. We've said it again and again, but unfortunately, we think the days of just ghostwriting, especially significant content that can impact your life and your livelihood, I think those days might kind of be over, or we're kind of seeing the end of them. So if you are a freelance writer and your job is to produce content for SEO purposes, I think it's really important to think about establishing a profile for yourself and a reputation for yourself, and maybe think about starting your own site, or getting on these sites that Google looks to, like LinkedIn, for kind of a citation about why you're trustworthy and credible within your industry. So it's a little bit scary, and I think it's a big shift in the SEO landscape and what we've had to do as SEOs, but it's a good thing because the goal is to obviously reduce fake news and information that's not credible, and situations where a bad piece of content starts to circulate and now everybody thinks that's the truth. I think that's kind of the direction that Google's going in, to try to avoid that.
Yeah, I agree. And this is getting a lot of attention, right? And it's going to up a lot of people's game. So as you think about what your competitors are doing, they're probably trying to think of this too. They're probably trying to think of ways of further bolstering and developing their content in different ways as well. So I think that's also plays into why we need to always stay ahead of it and create more creative, newer ways of servicing our users with the best information possible. And I really like your example with Google Home and how that's playing into everything with the answer boxes. At the end of the day, Google is a business, right?
Exactly.
They want to be providing the best experience to their users so that they can continue to sell products and advertisements, right?
Exactly.
So taking that into consideration, I think it just brings us back to the point of just think about, are you creating the absolute best experience for a person who's performing that query and a person who's trying to find out that information? And if that's really the end goal of your strategy and of the content that you're creating, then you'll be in a good place.
For sure.
All right, well, let's wrap up with some of the main takeaways from today.
Sure. So from my end, I think EAT is not going anywhere, even if some people will kind of deny the importance of EAT or whether it's actually happening. We think very strongly that this is where Google's going. Users come first, as you just mentioned, Corbin. Google is being held accountable for the quality of the content that it puts out there. And this is just their end goal, is to provide a good experience for users and to instill trust in their users and give them a consistently good experience. And this is another example of an algorithm update that is slowly diminishing the ability of gray hat and black hat tactics to work at all. So there's still some people out there doing black hat SEO. More power to you, but I don't think that these tactics are going to work for very much longer. They might work for a very short period, but we just see more and more, good SEO requires white hat strategies. It requires following Google's guidelines, listening to their recommendations, and so, with the most recent iteration of the search quality guidelines, we know that it's really important to take a look at that and think about how that actually impacts how you build out your content.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with all of those points, and I think the three steps that I'm kind of thinking about when thinking about how to actually incorporate the EAT initiative into our strategy is it's really just get familiar with the search quality guidelines first and foremost, right? Just understand what they actually are and how they might be playing into your site's content and how it might impact your site overall. And then first, let's look at the content that actually exists across your site. How is it performing now? Has it been impacted? And are there those areas where we can start to incorporate some of those EAT initiatives immediately? And then the last step of this, and this is really as more of an ongoing strategy, is how do we bake this into the actual content strategy moving forward? How do you make sure that those items are being incorporated into the process, whether it be authorship, citations, sourcing the right actual experts, making sure that that's part of the actual process so we're not having to go back and manipulate this a month later after publishing.
Exactly.
All right. Well, that wraps up the presentation portion, but we definitely want to jump into a couple of questions. So we're going to pull those up right now.
Yeah, so the first question is, does Google tend to prefer content that has a physical author listed as opposed to content with no byline or content attributed to the brand generally? So this is a really good question, and something that we've seen kind of varying answers to. So for one, if you are a brand that has, let's say, a handful of service pages and About Us pages and product pages, obviously that's content that's coming from the brand. So for those types of pages, there's no need to go in and say who actually authored this page. But then within the blog, we do seem to see a correlation between sites that are doing quite well and sites where the author of the blog is listed and then his or her credentials are also listed either via an author page or maybe a little pop-up. So I think it depends on the type of content, but there's also some examples where you're a very well-trusted brand and, on the blog you'll say, this content is written by XYZ brand, like our team, and I've seen that perform well as well. So I think it depends on the type of content, and it depends how credible you are as a brand.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it go back to the point of, is this the type of content that should be tied to an individual, or should it be tied to a brand? I think when we look at that, is it blog content where an opinion is being asserted?
Right.
Is it a piece of news content, or is it a piece of content where an actual advice is being given? And under those instances, I would say tying it to an actual expert would be the best approach. But if it's more of a general overview page, you're reviewing maybe a topic or a product or something like that, having it tied to your brand, I think is okay, assuming that your brand is closely tied to that actual topic and has the authority within that topic.
Definitely.
All right. So the next question we have is in regards to citations. So when you talk about adding citations to the content, is it best practice to just list the sources, or should you link to each one? Some of our content contains quite a few citations, but you also said that in some industries, having too many links on a page could be detrimental.
Interesting question.
Yeah.
I would, in this situation, think back to a website like Wikipedia, which we all know ranks number one for almost everything, right? Like, all of us are probably competing with Wikipedia. And if you think about how many citations they have on each page, it's a good amount. And, often at the end they'll have that kind of list of all the different citations where they got all that content from. So I think if you're in a situation where you have 200 words of copy on the page and 40 citations, like, you might want to think about why that page even exists if you're just reusing everybody else's content. So I think it's relative to the number of words on the page, but I definitely think it's important to cite as many as possible, especially when we get into those YMYL topics.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think I would err on the side of citation for sure. I think that's the recommendations that Google is providing within the guidelines is this content that's actually being cited from a third party. And like you had said earlier, they're going to know if it's coming from someone else, even if it's moderately reworded.
Exactly.
They're going to be able to pick up on that. So I definitely err on that side. And then to your point earlier in the conversation, when you do have that type of content that is being cited so many times, maybe that is a good opportunity to come up with some actual internal expertise or some internal reviews and experiments perhaps that you can actually cite yourself to have on. And that's kind of where we're going with how can we create content that's a little bit outside the box and going a little bit above and beyond to kind of shine above competition.
Definitely.
All right, so we have one other question here, and so this question is around blog content, and it's asking, will it now be mandatory to share this information and details about our writer just to rank? So the question is around if they should be actually sharing the names of the blog writers that are contributing.
So yeah, this is a tricky question, and it's definitely the one that raises the most eyebrows because a lot of people have been writing content for a very long time, kind of in the background, not necessarily saying who they are. But so we don't necessarily think it's mandatory to disclose the actual author so long as you are saying what the editorial review process is. Right. If it's medical content, to say, all of our content is looked at by this and this doctor, this is their credentials. So if you're in a situation where you really don't want to say who the author is, I think that's the best approach. But I think ideally, yes, you should have a team of writers that are associated to your brand, because they actually do say in the search quality guidelines, being anonymous can be a problem. Why are you being anonymous? What do you have to hide? So they are actually asking people to kind of put their names behind their content. Yeah. Yep.
I think that's a good point in it. Another aspect of it is highlighting the certifications or licensing that the website and the company behind the website actually has.
Right.
Because that'll be a major aspect that Google will pick up on from an authoritative site-wide perspective. And I agree with you that if you're able to attribute the content to an actual author, an actual person, then that's going to be the best case scenario, especially if you're investing in this authorship, because that's going to be just further developing your actual strategy if you have a few authors that are really going to start to be able to get accredited to this topic and to this area of expertise.
Cool. So the next question is, what should a small e-tailer do to improve its EAT? It's a good question. So, there seems to be a lot of this algorithm seemingly favoring big sites that have been around for a very long time, that have established reputations. I think there's definitely a component of that. But that's not to say that if you're a small startup or e-commerce company that you can't also compete. So I think, as far as e-tailers are concerned, just making sure that you have those regular old trust signals that we talk about when we're doing conversion rate optimization, and we talk about with site speed and HTTPS, and all of those security signals are really important. Giving people a good experience during the transaction process, good return policy, making it really clear, with customer service, like not sending them in a million directions to be able to call you and pick up the phone. Things like live chat are really effective for e-tailers. I think the more of these signals that you have, the more you can kind of organically build up a reputation for being a good website to transact on. And then, eventually getting like a Trustpilot account and citing that on your website as well. These are things that kind of exponentially build up the trustworthiness around your brand. So even if you're a small company, it's not to say that you can't compete in this new landscape. Yeah, reviews is a huge piece to that. And I would also say this is another opportunity to focus the content, right? Especially if you're a smaller retailer going up against larger companies. The best way I have found of approaching that is to just own your areas of focus and really invest in those topics and those categories, because that's where you're going to be able to kind of get a leg up on that competition, where they might be spread thin across 100 things. If you own the area that you care most about and really invest in that content, you can see some success there too. Sure. All right.
right, so the next question we have is, what's the best way to establish author expertise, especially on existing content? If you don't have dedicated author bio pages, is a bio at the bottom of the content enough?
It's a good question. I think if you're in a position where you're not able to build author bio pages, then yes, absolutely, have that block of content at the bottom as opposed to not having anything at all. But, like CMS platforms like WordPress actually make this really easy. So, a lot of the times people will set up a WordPress site and they'll maybe disable the author feature because that's something that's just built into the system. But actually using that feature can help in a post-EAT world. So, if your CMS doesn't support it or your company doesn't want to have that type of page, then yeah, like having a little byline on the page is helpful. But I would definitely explore, like, why not have a page that talks about our writers? Maybe use our About page to kind of list off who those people are.
Yeah, and I would also recommend, in addition to creating those pages, if you are going with the byline on the page or just a bio on that page, offer external links to their LinkedIn, to their Twitter, to other areas that will prove that that person creating that content is an actual expert in the field, because that will definitely be picked up on if they're able to see that, hey, this person writing this content based off their LinkedIn has been in this industry for 5 years. That's going to be another potential signal that they're an expert.
For sure. So this question is, if your website is pivoting or shifting gears, how do you get Google to see your site as credible on the new topic? How long does it take for Google to see the site as credible for a new topic area?
Yes, this is a good question, especially with how we've talked about so much around authority and building that authority for your site. So if you are shifting gears, it's definitely adds an element of difficulty. I think the number one way I would look at this first and foremost is making sure that you're creating the proper About Us and company-wide material that will be kind of the backbone of where you're shifting gears and where you're going to be an authority in the future, so that Google and users can actually see, hey, this is the aspect that we're credible in, this is what we're focused on, and then you can build the tertiary content around that to further develop the actual expertise within that realm.
For sure. Yeah, I think it's definitely an added challenge to become credible on a new topic that your brand doesn't have any history in. But as we mentioned before about leveraging industry experts to help you out with that, whether it be them doing a guest contribution on your site, or maybe you doing a really fantastic piece of content and sending it to them and asking for them to share it on social. Anything like that can help Google see, you know what, like they're venturing into this new area, but it seems like they have the right kind of authorities who are vouching for them.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Potentially partnering with people who are already credited in the space is a great strategy. Another question we have is, if we leverage freelance writers or influencers, how can we make sure the content is up to snuff?
That is a fantastic question. So, obviously, just taking a look at it and making sure that it passes your own personal criteria for what good content looks like. You can take some of the content and literally copy-paste it and see to what extent it's plagiarized. Even if that just means rewording other people's content, that's something that you want to avoid. So if you see a lot of results out there on Google that seem to be what that person just wrote, that's a red flag. There's also great tools that you can use for this purpose. We use one at Path called readable.io, and that actually tells you, readability scores, vocabulary level, word counts, just all of this kind of quantitative analysis about how good the content is. And Google also has this NLP tool, natural language processing, that you can run it through. So there's tools out there now to help you assess what content quality looks like. Yeah, absolutely. And I think running those also against the content that's being created, but also against those that are performing best is a great way of getting a comparison, because the highest level of writing might not always be the best experience for someone either. So trying to compare those two. There's also a lot of now freelance tools that you can leverage that do house you experts within that field already. So seeing if they do have content that's been created in that category already, I think is another way of just being able to vet the people you're working with. For sure.
All right. Well, I think we're coming up right on the hour now, so thank you everyone for joining the webinar. We really appreciate it. We do have a bunch of questions that we weren't able to get to, but we will do our best to follow up on those afterwards. And just so everyone knows, this webinar is going to be available on demand starting tomorrow, and we'll also be sending out follow-up email that will have all of the information to get that as well.
And if you didn't get your question answered, feel free to tweet us as well. So you can tweet us at Conductor or at Pass Interactive, and we'll get back to you.
Thank you to Lily Ray for joining us today, and thank you everyone for actually contributing with questions and joining the webinar.
Thanks for having me, guys. Bye, everyone.